We light this chalice on the brink of spring, the burgeoning sunlight, the bursting growth of seeds. We are open and hopeful for what may come, ready to live life fully. May we move forward with intention.
Don't steal my notes. That's a good start to the morning. Good morning. Maybe she should steal my notes. We'll find out. I'm going to open this service this morning with a sentence that was printed in the New York Times in 2016. In 1838, the Jesuit priests at Georgetown University, a Catholic institution, needed money to keep the university alive. That was an introduction to an article that was published in the New York Times. The article goes on to report on the sale of people enslaved by this Jesuit university. And it reports the human cargo was loaded on ships at a bustling wharf in the nation's capital, destined for the plantations of the Deep South. Some slaves pleaded for rosaries as they were rounded up, praying for deliverance. But on this day in the fall of 1838, no one was spared. Not the 2-month-old baby and her mother, not the field hands, not the shoemaker, and not Cornelius Hawkins, who was about 13 years old when he was forced aboard. Now, meaning at the time the article was written, with racial protests roiling college campuses, an unusual collection of Georgetown professors, students, alumna, and genealogists is trying to find out what happened to those 272 men, women, and children. And they are confronting a particularly wrenching question. What, if anything, is owed to the descendants of slaves who were sold to help secure the college's survival. The enslaved people had been imprisoned on land in Maryland that helped to fund the operations of Georgetown. The article reports that they were required to attend Mass for the sake of their salvation, but also whipped and sold. That's what we're going to talk about today. So thank you very much for being here. Bruce?
Gets back at you there. You're on board.
I have trouble with this mask thing. Putting it off, taking it on. Sometimes I don't know where I should wear it and where I shouldn't anymore. Okay, welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. I am Kelly Patterson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and thank you for joining us. We welcome all of you to our service, especially those of you who are searching for something more. More love, more joy, more freedom, more service, more learning. Whether it's your first time here in service with us or your 100th time, we hope that you'll find here questions that stretch you, people to befriend you, and liberal religious values that challenge you to join us in loving radically, serving justly, and growing spiritually and emotionally. Our first hymn is number 150 in, is it in the blue book, or is it in, it's in the gray hymnal? 150 in the gray hymnal, all those whose boast it is. And our song leader is Louisa Alcorn.
Second and third verses.
Yes.
I decided it was time. So I signed up for the newsletter and like it was like some other thing, like something with Wednesday. Anyway, like about like activities and stuff at the church. So that, drop your ass, boy. Sign up. Barb kind of sings up a little higher, but she's like pitch control and all that stuff. Like,
I'm sorry? No children's chapel. Okay, Elaine and Becky are coming up and they're going to talk to us about the food fair.
Yeah, this may not be your flavor, guys.
So, Elaine Imlau, how are you doing today?
Becky Jones, how are you? You're back from California. How was the trip?
It was great. It was great, but it's time to get caught up on things. So I'm wondering about the food fair this year. What's happening?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Event offerings and sale to sell and food items for auction are due in less than 2 weeks. And we have to make sure David Whitkey can fill up his social calendar for next year.
I know, that's really important. So I remember when I first joined, it was such a great way to meet new people and make new friends. And that house party you had with Scott Stillwell, that was amazing. I had so much fun that night.
This year, I'm teaming up with a couple others to offer another house concert with my favorite local musician, Ryan Doty.
Ooh, Ryan Doty, he is awesome. He's a great folk singer. So hey, I also want to know, now there will be desserts and breads and other homemade items at the auction, correct?
All will happen if people submit their offerings by September 15th. Oh. When did it say that?
I didn't.
I didn't
yesterday.
type that, did I? It's been a little frazzled lately. The submission form is on the church website, and the kickoff for the sale is a little different this year.
Oh yeah, how so is that?
It's not going to be after church like it has in the past. We're kicking off the sale on Saturday evening, April 30th, with the post-pandemic party we paid for in 2020 when everything shut down. Dinner is free for everyone. We'll need RSVPs for dinner. There will be childcare and activities for the adults, and adults sign up for events and bid on their favorite foods. And we need RSVPs for childcare as well by April 15th.
Okay, well, I've been waiting for that post-pandemic party for a long time, so I'm really excited about that. But a Saturday night, huh? What if I'm already booked up or I'm out of town that weekend?
Date night, huh? Well, we're starting right at 5, so maybe you'll still be able to make it to another event that night. Or, as in the past, you can have someone who is going to sign you up for what you want and pay them for purchases later. And beginning the following Monday, May 2nd, the bidding and available events will be posted online through Bidding Owl like we had it last year.
Okay, that sounds great.
So remember, everybody, submissions are due online by when?
April 15.
And mark your calendars for the party on?
Saturday night, April 30th, 5 to 7:30.
Check the paper you received with the order of service for online links and more details. And you can make your reservation for the party today with Reba, Kara, or Mike in the gathering area right after the service. We hope to see you there.
Well, Reverend Amy always has a fun story for offering, but I don't really have a fun story, except we went to Portland and we went to the Unitarian Church of Portland. And then the Unitarian Church of Portland, you can't get in unless you have a vaccination card and you have a mask. And there weren't very many people there when we went there. And there's a whole lot of people here today, and they didn't have push pay there either, and we do. And so this is really easy offering. You can use the link if you're on Zoom with us to give today, or you're here and we're all together, and it's amazing. So this is our offering.
Thanks, Bruce. I also asked Bruce earlier to do a little riff on Change is Gonna Come, and loved what he did with it. For the meditation, I want to start with some words from Dr. King. In 1963, when Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he didn't begin with the utopian images of racial harmony, but with a metaphor. And here's what he said. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. What I would like you to do this morning in the context of reparations, which is what we're going to be talking about, I'd like you to reflect on Dr. King's metaphor and think what you as individuals, each of you, can do to pay that insufficient funds check.
A church is not the building, but a community of human hands and human hearts as we come together to share our laughter and our tears, and to bear witness and minister to one another as we struggle with life's sorrows and celebrate life's joys. We have a joy and a concern. From Mike Andruski, it is with great joy that I announce my candidacy for the Democratic nomination in Iowa House District 31 in West Des Moines. I hope to join Senator Zach Walz as a UU voice in the State House. And then we have a concern. Jane Flagler has been suffering with vertigo for a number of weeks. She is doing physical therapy and lots of walking, but has been informed that her recovery could still take a number of months. Charlie is providing meals, rides, etc., and they hope to return to church in person soon. Please keep Jane and Charlie in your thoughts and prayers during this healing process. Let us share together now the names of anyone we know who could use some special care and attention. As we type their names into the chat or call them out loud, may the love of this community hold them all. May we hold all these people up. Let us share together, may the light of our community shine on the broken places of the world. May the work of our hands and hearts support aid and comfort to all those who hunger and thirst for food or water, justice or freedom. May we never look away when we are needed. May those who are grieving be comforted. May those who are tired find rest. May the broken places be healed. May those who are filled with joy and laughter be abundant. Now together we light 3 candles, one for the joys and concerns we have shared, one for the names we have written and spoken, and the last candle for all the joys and all of the sorrows which are deeply held but remain unspoken here today.
The first reading today was produced by the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson's organization, and it'll take about 5 minutes, so watch the video if you would, and those of you at home will be able to see it, I think, without any problem. So I hope if our people running the board are ready. Are you ready to run the video?
In 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies by ship to Jamestown, Virginia, they held the legal status of servants. But as the region's economic system became increasingly dependent on forced labor, we descended into slavery. The institution of American slavery developed as a permanent, hereditary system centrally tied to race. Millions of Black people were forcibly taken from Africa, crammed on ships and brought to the Americas through a dangerous and deadly journey that crossed the Atlantic. Millions died. Once on our shores, slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or autonomy, and granted the slave owner complete power over the Black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. An ideology of white supremacy, a narrative of racial difference was created to rationalize and justify the continuation of slavery. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. In addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. The United States Congress finally banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808. Slavery was widely considered a gross human rights violation, yet enslavement was retained and persisted. The 1808 Declaration caused the demand for slave labor to skyrocket in the Lower South, and the domestic slave trade grew to meet this demand. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Slave traders chained African Americans together in couples and forced them to march hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Lower South. Steamboats carried slaves along the Alabama River. Rail routes constructed with slave labor brought hundreds of enslaved people to Montgomery, Alabama every day, turning the city into one of the largest slave trading communities in the United States. Enslaved people would be paraded up Commerce Street to slave warehouses and slave depots. The city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, now known as Court Square. Enslaved people of all ages were auctioned along with livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertising the sale of slaves included gender, age, skill, complexion, owner's name, and price. Slavery in America traumatized and devastated millions of people. Husbands and wives, parents and children could not protect themselves from being sold away from each other. Enslaved families were separated at an owner's or auctioneer's whim, never to see each other again. The domestic slave trade separated nearly half of all enslaved people from their spouses and parents. In 1833, the Alabama legislature banned free black people from residing in the state, meaning that enslavement was the only legally authorized status for African Americans. Even as the Civil War raged, slave trading in Montgomery flourished well into the mid-1860s. After the Confederacy's surrender in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery nationwide except as a punishment for crime. But in many former slave states, slavery did not end, it simply evolved. Southern whites, angry after losing the war, targeted black people who were largely abandoned by the federal government in the 1870s. For decades, black men, women, and children were tortured, terrorized, and killed by mobs and violent lynchings, oppressed by a system of racist laws and customs. For another 100 years, black people were racially segregated, denied the right to vote, education, and basic dignity. They were humiliated, beaten, or killed for minor offenses or for protesting. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s helped to end legally authorized racial segregation, but racial bias still persists. Today, a presumption of guilt is assigned to many people of color who are disproportionately arrested, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime as a white person. 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime. Police violence against black people is so epidemic that civil rights demonstrations have shut down cities across the U.S. as thousands of people march to protest police brutality. Many states celebrate the era of slavery with Confederate holidays and by honoring the defenders and the architects of slavery while ignoring the history of enslavement. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that racial bias remains a serious problem and is a direct and lasting legacy of American slavery and our failure to deal with the history of racial injustice. The Equal Justice Initiative seeks to foster an honest conversation about the legacy of slavery, about mass incarceration, and racial inequality and how it still affects millions of people today. We can confront and overcome bias and discrimination. Please join us in this conversation so that we can move forward together.
One night I dreamed I was in slavery. About 1850 was the time. Sorrow was the only sign, nothing around to ease my mind. Out of the night appeared a lady leading a distant pilgrim band. First mate she caught pointing her hand, make room aboard for this young woman, saying, come on up, I got a lifeline, come on up to this train of mine, come on up, I got a lifeline, come on up to this train of mine. She said her name was Harriet Tubman, and she drove for the Underground Railroad.
Hundreds of miles we traveled onward, gathering slaves from town to town, seeking every lost and found, setting those free who once were bound. Somehow my heart was growing weaker, it fell by the wayside, sinking sand. Firmly did this lady stand, lifted me up and took my hand, saying, come on up, I got a lifeline, come on up to this train of mine, come on up, I got a lifeline, come on up to this train of mine. She said her name was Harriet Tubman, and she drove for the Underground Railroad. Who are these children dressed in red? They must be the ones that Moses led. Who are these children dressed in red? They must be the ones that Moses led. Come on up, I've got a lifeline. Come on up to this train of mine. Come on up, I got a lifeline. Come on up to this train of mine. She said her name was Harriet Tubman, and she drove for the Underground Railroad. Follow the drinking gourd. You gotta follow the drinking gourd.
This next piece was written by Jennifer Harvey, who is a professor of religion at Drake University. She's the author of Dear White Christians, for those still longing for racial reconciliation, second edition, Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America. Virtually every existing racial disparity between white and Black communities in the United States can be meaningfully traced back to one of two original sins. Alongside the disposition and genocide of Native communities, unredressed legacies of enslavement impact all the conditions of racial life in America. These legacies are generational. From enslavement to sharecropping to Jim and Jane Crow, to exclusions from unions, Social Security, and federal housing loans, to mass incarceration and policing. Systemic subjugation shows up today in everything from housing to educational access, to wealth, to public health, and more. Any area of social life where individual and communal well-being can be reliably associated with racial identity, therefore, is a necessary candidate for targeted systemic interventions through reparations. In the late 1960s, also amidst significant civic turmoil and calls for substantive transformation in the economic and political circumstances of Black life, a cross-section of Black leaders from across the nation drafted the Black Manifesto. James Forman, former executive secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, brought the manifesto into public view by disrupting services to read its demands at Riverside Church in New York City on May 4th, 1969. The manifesto indicted white churches' membership for having exploited and continuing to profit from Black people. It made persuasively clear that reparations were morally due from white Christians to Black communities. The manifesto included a list of concrete points of redress to which the reparations would be channeled. These were power-shifting interventions that would have meaningfully impacted the economic, educational, political, and health realities of Black life in America. Yet, the predominantly and historically white congregations and denominations to whom the manifesto was addressed turned away. They repudiated the drafters' methods and the document's demands. This no didn't happen in a vacuum. It coincided with a fissure between many white and Black Christians as the latter engaged in more and more with Black power movements in the late 1960s. We now have a centering song, number 170. In your gray hymnal, We Are a Gentle, Angry People, verses 1, 2, 4, and 6.
So I want to pick up on the Georgetown story. The enslaved people had been imprisoned on land in Maryland that helped to fund the operations of Georgetown University. The article reports, as I said, that they were required to attend Mass for the sake of their salvation, but they were also whipped and sold. According to the Reverend Thomas Murphy, a historian at Seattle University who has written a book about the Jesuits and slavery, the Catholic Church did not view slaveholding as immoral at that time. The sale in 1838 generated about $3.3 million in today's currency. And in what appears to me to be an almost inconceivable and brutal irony, the priests were so concerned about the future of the souls of the people that they were selling that provisions were placed in the sale documents that required the buyers would ensure that the slaves would continue to be able to practice their Catholic faith. Families would not be separated, and the money raised by the sale would not be used to pay off debts or operating expenses of the university. Needless to say, the people doing the research reported that none of those conditions were actually met by the buyers. The outcome of this research, driven in part by student demands, was the establishment of a reparations program by Georgetown University that included an apology from the university, the establishment of a foundation to raise money, a number of financial incentives for the descendants of the enslaved people, and other programs to redress the wrongs of the past. It's a story well worth studying and pursuing. Making amends for a wrong that one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged has a long history. That history has included making reparations. In my world as a practicing lawyer, courts could require reparations in the form of financial damages to compensate victims of personal injury or contractual wrongdoing. In the world of restorative justice practices, acknowledging the harm that has been caused and making amends and rectifying the wrong is a form of reparations. Reparations have sometimes been required from those who have started wars and then lost, such as the Versailles Treaty after World War I. In other words, this is not a new concept. The application of that concept to our history of racial injustice and oppression has a long history also and has become energized in our time as the issue of racial justice has moved to the front of our consciousness, including proposed legislation in Congress, which has yet to pass. What is clear is that our history of racial suppression and violence has left deep and lasting scars on all of us. When I was first introduced to the concept of reparations related to our history of enslavement, I thought of it almost entirely in terms of money for historical wrongs, and frankly was unable to grasp how this was going to work out. The invasion of this continent by largely white European settlers and the ensuing decimation of the indigenous peoples, the history of slave trafficking, the actual concept or creation of the concept of race, the mistreatment of other minorities by the white male ruling class permeates our history. It was so overwhelming to me that I had no idea what real action might be taken. Fortunately for me, that has slowly changed over time. Authors like Jennifer Harvey, Michelle Alexander, Isabel Wilkerson, Brian Stevenson, and many others have clearly articulated the moral arguments for reparations. Ta-Nehisi Coates published an article in the Atlantic magazine in 2014, for example, that set out the case for reparations by telling the stories of those who had been enslaved. More recently, the movement for Black Lives, as a part of its policy statements, created a demand for reparations. And they started that portion of their demands with the following statement: "We demand reparations for the past and continuing harms. The government, responsible corporations, and other institutions that have profited off of the harm that they have inflicted on Black people, from colonialism to slavery, through food and housing redlining, mass incarceration and surveillance, those institutions must repair the harm done." The article goes on to describe 5 demands and then links those demands to a workbook on how to proceed. But once again, those demands were at such a high level, requiring massive governmental and institutional action, that I couldn't get my head around them, frankly. Probably the major breakthrough for me personally came when I read the demands of the National African American Reparations Commission. It includes a section in our criminal injustice system, which includes the following: ever since the forced arrival of the enslaved Africans in the Americas, policing and penal policies and practices were enacted to discipline, control, and acclimate Black people to systems of exploitation. The criminal injustice system, which evolved, was and is a direct extension and protector of the interests of the corporate and political elites in the U.S. From runaway slave patrols, vagrancy laws, chain gangs, the convict lease system, to relentless police violence, killings, and mass incarceration. Racist policies and practices have decimated Black communities and severely constrained civil and human rights and the socio-economic and political aspirations of Black people. The war on drugs, with its attendant racially biased police policies and practices, is only the most recent manifestation of this long-standing war on Black people. Apologies from elected officials, leaders, and institutions responsible for fostering and benefiting politically from this unjust system are not sufficient. The damages to Black families and communities must be repaired. This actually opened a path for me related to the work that I've been doing, attempting to make systemic changes that would derail the cradle-to-prison pipeline. It also dovetailed into my family history. So I want to take a step back and share with you some of that history. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I was a war baby, having been born in 1944. My parents were both raised on farms. My mom's farm was a Century Farm, located just north of Marion, Iowa, on Highway 13. A Century Farm means that it was acquired during the middle part of the 19th century after we had stolen land from the indigenous people and colonized that land by the westward movement of largely white European settlers. My mother's family was among those, and that farm is still owned by my mother's family. My dad grew up on a small farm outside of La Plata, Missouri. La Plata is a small town in the northeast part of Missouri. It was a sunset town and had a sign that I can remember that made that fact very clear. A sunset town or city was a place that you were banned from being after sunset if you were Black. They existed all over the United States, not just the South. The Harrison side of my family immigrated from Scotland in the 17th and 18th centuries. There are a lot of Harrisons in the United States. A goodly number of them settled in Jones County, North Carolina, and became farmers. My great-great-grandparents, William and Mary, owned a farm in Jones County. They had 15 children, according to the old census records that I looked at. In 1856, William and Mary sold their land and moved to Missouri. The deed from that sale was executed on the 28th day of March, 1856, and transferred the land to F.G. Simmons for the sum of $2,000. An interesting side note that might interest you is that this deed was signed only by William. That was an era when women had no rights in property. My ancestors purchased a farm with the proceeds of the sale of their land and their personal property, and it is that farm that my father grew up on outside of La Plata, Missouri. On the same page as the deed that I looked at, there was another transaction that was included. The document described a transaction, a sale, by which William's brother Amos sold, and this is the quote, a Negro woman slave named Matilda and a certain Negro boy slave named John to Calvin Coolidge Kuntz for $1,250. So far as I have been able to determine, those two transactions are legally unrelated, but they are definitely, for me, connected. I know from the 1840 and the 1850 census records that my great-great-grandparents, William and Mary, enslaved 8 people. The census records from that era before the Civil War listed the enslaved people as personal property and included the number, but not the names. William's brothers were also enslavers, and the census records that I looked at made the following listing: Daniel 3, Amos 5, Franklin 45, Ira 9, John 13, and Thomas 18. All of those people are a part of my extended family. I've actually been unable to find any direct record of what happened to the 8 people enslaved by William and Mary when they were sold, or when they sold their land in North Carolina, but I do know they were sold. The deed that I received from the sale from Amos to Calvin Kuntz represented actually a normal transaction at that time in our history. When enslaved people were sold, it was treated as the transfer of a chattel, in other words, personal property, like a car. When I called the records clerk in Jones County to ask about the records showing the sale of the people enslaved by William and Mary, I was told that the records, if there ever were any, were destroyed during the Civil War. My father did share on more than one occasion over the years the oral tradition that survived in our family and was passed down within my family about the people that William and Mary sold. And that story went something like this. When the people enslaved by my ancestors learned that the farm was being sold and that William and Mary were moving to Missouri, those folks begged and pleaded to be moved also. The family narrative being that William and Mary were such kind and gentle and loving owners that the people who they enslaved loved them and could not stand the thought of being separated from them. I can imagine that my ancestors' reported concern for those 8 people was about the same as that of the Jesuit priests at Georgetown, expressing concern for the immortal souls of the enslaved people that they sold. We all know that such self-serving stated concerns were and are a convenient lie. My family narrative ends with this generation. My dad died in 2008, and my mom died in 2015. By that time, I was fully engaged in retirement and the ongoing work of attempting to change the systemic residue of our country's history of colonialism and slavery. I had also read Jennifer Harvey's work and was a convert to the idea that we in this country owe reparations for the past and the ongoing actions that have maintained the caste system described so eloquently by Michelle Alexander and Isabel Wilkerson. The question still remained, however, is that what could I as an individual do in my community to acknowledge the harm that my family has done, make amends in the form of working to heal the open wounds that are so apparent all around me? And that was a real challenge. The movement for Black Lives demands focus on such a high level of institutional change that I simply cannot get my head around them, and still can't, frankly. I wanted something that I could do personally in my home community, Des Moines, Iowa. Once my thinking came to that point, the answer actually was pretty straightforward. Because of the racial justice work that I have been doing since my retirement in 2011, and the intersection of the Georgetown story and the sale, the deeper understanding of reparations theory that Jennifer Harvey helps provide, and the connection to the work that Ellen and I have been doing and others, and the inheritance that I received from my parents, all of those things kind of merged together in what looked to me to be a path forward. So what I did was I set aside a portion of that inheritance, an inheritance that I can actually directly trace to the sale of enslaved people in 1856 by my great-great-grandparents, and I'm using it to support the programs that Ellen and I are engaged in. Each of these programs are designed to make systemic changes in how we deal with the disproportionality in all of the injustice systems in our country. They include a public school conflict resolution program that is called Let's Talk, that is sponsored by Amos, which is an institution this church supports annually. It includes efforts to participate in an effective juvenile court diversion program to keep juveniles out of the criminal justice system. And it includes the Just Voices program, which is an extension of the Racial Profiling Project, an organization that this church has chosen to support in this fiscal year as a Faith in Action partner. It actually feels right. This is what Jennifer Harvey says about the moral logic. The moral logic of reparations isn't just for white Christians, of course, but in the moment and movement that young Black leaders are bringing to every city across the nation right now, all people of faith have a particular opportunity to step up, to lend their voices and social power to this moral course. If they do, that's one way we'll know whether, at least among white Americans, this moment can be truly different. I personally believe that the moment can be different, and I think my church must be a part of making it different. It feels very much like being on the path that John Lewis described when he said, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And I want to thank you, my friends, in this church for helping me walk along that path. So may it be.
Thank you, Harvey. We extinguish this chalice, but we know that its fire will continue to burn away all that we wish to relinquish. Our last song is number 151 in your gray hymnal, I Wish I Knew How, verses 1 through 4.
Thank you again. If you want, next week, Lori Young, who is my companion in some of this work, and I are going to do the forum at 11 o'clock. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a deep dive into the 2020 Racial Protest Project, the People's History, which is a part of what you are funding with the contributions that you make to Just Voices. So invite your friends. It's for everybody to listen to. So thank you all. Service is ended. Go making hell.